Welcome, everyone. Today, we are pleased to offer a presentation on the importance of decentralized identity. We're going to hold 10 minutes at the end of the session for questions and answers. We have 4 panelists today. Sridhar Mapidi is our lead panelist. He is the IBM Fellow and Chief Technology Officer in IBM Security Systems. Vanita Bashan is the President and Enterprise Architect at Pontus Research. Chris Fields is the Vice President of Security Strategy at Pathmaker Group. And Eric Schultz is a Senior Security Architect for Secure IT.
And welcome everyone to the second of our virtual panel series. We're very excited to be here, and we're going to be talking about decentralized identities. But just to level set, right? If you or I go today to an application or any resource on the internet, what do? We put in a digital identity, and that digital identity is what was issued to us by some issuing authority. And then we put something else along with that, maybe a password or a code that's on our phone, whatever it is. We provide this information, and then somebody decides that, yep, this identity and this information is authentic, and therefore you can access whatever you're looking to do. It all works. The point is there are issues, right? As we all know, what happens? One is we have a ton of digital identities. There's no real portability across them. We've got one that's given to us by maybe the company we work with. We've got another one when we go to our Target website, whatever it is. So ultimately, we've got all these digital identities we have to manage without any ability to use the same one in multiple spots, right? The second part is their security. Your identity and your information is only as secure as the repository in which it sits. So again, you've got a security issue. And the third one is the risk. You've got companies managing and maintaining these centralized databases, and now they are responsible. And if anything gets hacked or breached, guess what? We're all up in arms, and it's just not good for brand credibility, etc. So ultimately, there are issues with this working solution today of digital identities. So the next step that we're looking at, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is decentralized identities. Before we jump into that, Sridhar, I want to say thank you very much for agreeing to be with us today. And I will tell you, the minute I called him and asked him about it, he said yes off the bat. And he's usually very hard to get a hold of. So thank you very much. We're very excited to talk to you about this interesting topic. We hope you will ask us lots of questions. And this is all about how are we all going to move into the future of IAM. So we're all in this together. It's collaborative. So with that, let's jump to the panel discussion. And I believe, Chris, it's over to you.
Thank you, Vanita.
All right. Thank you, Vanita. So everyone is familiar with the centralized federated identity model. What are the issues we might get into now that we're moving towards privacy and data ownership? And Sridhar, that's probably one I think you can give us some context on.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call it issues per se, right? We've been on this journey to provide a better control of identities, better consumability of identities, more portability for a number of years, right? Starting with centralized identity, as you said, federation gives us a mechanism to authenticate once and potentially use it in many different places, and helps in consumability of how you use single sign-on and others. So as we look at the maturity of this, what we're seeing is, number one, there's still lack of portability, right? We still have a lot of IDs that we hold near and dear to us, and that causes not just a security issue, but also usability. Number two is that, you still have that call home situation where the relying party over here always has to depend on some sort of a central identity provider. And last but not the least, I think you mentioned it as well, is the privacy aspect, right? Let's say I'm going to a service provider that is a retailer, and I'm authenticating to an identity provider that may have information that service provider doesn't really care about or need, but yet, some of this information may travel there. So privacy becomes another concern in these type of protocols. This is purely from a protocol perspective, right? But if you switch to the client situation, the clients, what they're saying is, Sridhar, how do I deal with this users that span across multiple domains, right? The fact that my retail and my healthcare and my travel, they don't necessarily participate in one big single sign-on per se, right? How do I reduce fraud is another question that comes up quite often. And third one, which I think, most often we don't talk about it as much, but we should, maybe I should have led with that, is consumability and user experience. How do I continue to simplify my experience and reduce that large number of passwords, Chris? These are some of the things that we're hearing as federation is getting more and more mature, and clients are looking for that next generation.
So Sridhar, is it fair to think of decentralized identities as those that users bring with them, similar to like what we think about with BYOD today?
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. I mean, as you, if you look at the decentralized identity technology, it's very similar to the federation that you see in this slide. But if you go to the next slide, what you see is you still have that issuer and the holder and the relying party, but the difference is there is no call home button, right? Instead, you're trusting on a distributed technology. You're trusting on a distributed ledger technology in this case. So think about it very, very similar to DNS. When you do google.com or IBM.com, typically you go to a name server, get resolved, and then you launch that web server. You don't necessarily go to the issuer of the domain name. Very similar concept over here, right? Where the holder in this case is going to a specific identity, rather getting proved or getting vetted, but once that credentials are issued, they hold them close to themselves. But of course, just like in the DNS, you have to hold some public information in a common place that is held in a public ledger, as you see at the bottom, the distributed ledger. So there's no central point of failure per se. And once you do that, then the flows become fairly straightforward, where if I'm being asked to go to present my identity, I can go and present my identity based on what I have, and the relying party can verify that based on distributed technologies versus going back home on who issued it, right? That helps us tremendously. And then it also addresses the point that Chris, you made about privacy, right? We call it selective disclosure, where you can deal with scenarios like, I just want to go to the bar and have a drink, don't need to show when I was born or where do I live. All I need to prove is I'm over 21. So you can provide proof of possession without necessarily disclosing the date of birth, as an example, right? And that helps in some of the privacy situations as well.
All right. So thanks, Sridhar, for covering that. So how do these concepts you discussed above translate into use cases?
Yeah, no, great question. I think we can talk about technology all day long. I think we live and breathe with use cases, right? It's still maturing. This technology has been there for a while, and we've been talking about the concepts of self-sovereignty and other concepts for a while. And a number of use cases are emerging as we work with clients. I can categorize them in three different ways. One is clients are basically using this technology to provide better end user experience and control. This goes back to the consumability aspect that we talked about before, and control, which is like, why do I need to share more information than I have to, as an example, right? The second use case, which is becoming more and more popular, is security. Our clients want to figure out how do they want to reduce risk. As you see the proliferation of data breach attacks and 70 million IDs on the dark web, or 50 million IDs breached, me as a consumer, I'm sitting helpless, right? Shoot, my identity is compromised and some of the data is externalized to folks. And organizations have to pay hefty fines, and they're continuing to take the risk. So the second sort of use case is around reducing that risk. How do I reduce the risk of onboarding? How do I know that this is Chris or not Chris, right? How do I make sure that I don't incur the cost of authentication and password resets? I mean, most of the costs are still there, as you know. So the second use case is focusing on, Eric, to your point, bring your own identity concept, but a little bit more privacy enabled, selective disclosure enabled, a little bit more distributed technology, so that you're not necessarily depending upon one entity per se, right? And the third one, which we're seeing, is the ecosystem concept, right? The end users' interactions span across multiple business silos. Take, for example, travel, right? As you fine, most of us are not traveling, but as you can imagine, right? As you travel, you span across airline and car rental and hotel and frequent flyer points and credit cards, which are all different identity systems today. And there are use cases where some of these industries are coming together, like healthcare, right? They're basically saying, how do I make it better for the patient, right? How do I put patient in the front and center to say, as I'm going to insurance, as I'm going to clinician, as I'm going to pharmacy, how do I ensure that the end user can use their identity across all of these different domains of trust seamlessly, right? Those are the different types. And talking about healthcare, one scenario which is close to my heart, as well as very pertinent in today's climate, comes to my mind, is about COVID, post-COVID, I would say, right? We're working on a solution where, as you can imagine, as many of us are getting back into work and understand that, this is only the beginning and there may be more of such things in the future, we have to figure out a mechanism by which we can have individuals get vaccinated or whatever that is, in terms of providing a proof that, hey, I've gone through a certain process to ensure that I can be in the office. Check your temperature as an example, right? Mm-hmm. And that is typically given by your hospitals, your clinicians, your emergency clinics, or even your neighborhood clinics, and in some cases, makeshift units, etc. Whereas the folks who will be dependent on that would be, your offices, your governments, your variety of different establishments. They don't necessarily have the same techniques to provide that quote unquote, immunization or anything that matters to prove that you've gone through that process, right? So that's where we're working on a solution where ecosystem of entities that are able to issue that verification, or issue that immunization record, for the lack of a better word, to say that, how do I make sure that, Sridhar has been vaccinated, and then put that proof into the distributed ledger so that you can then use that as a mechanism to go to a variety of different businesses without having to go get different credentials from different places.
So Sridhar, I have a question around that, right? This sounds great. What am I going to have? Another piece of plastic, something on my cell phone? What am I going to have? More stuff to keep track of? Or how do you see this working out?
Great question. So I think, part of it is that end user is in control of their credentials, and that comes with accountability as well, right? I think there may be the subtle point that you're making, where the end user will have some sort of a virtual wallet, right? I use the word virtual because I'm not tied to a specific thing, right? As long as you are able to access that wallet, whether that wallet is put in your mobile device, whether it's put in your, credit card with smart chip on it, or, future of some sort of a, laptop, that's technology evolving. Or in some cases, you may even lose the wallet, and in which case, how do you go and retrieve that from a cloud-based systems where it may be stored encrypted, like using things like homomorphic encryption, where the provider does not see the details, right? So it's typically a wallet, and I took a little bit longer time to explain that to show the concept of wallet, right? We have a wallet. In my wallet, I have a credit card for my personal use, credit card for my business use. I have a driver's license, healthcare. These are all the different ways that you're proving your identity, as well as providing a set of attributes, right? What we call verifiable credentials. MIT, as an example, is giving out their transcripts as verifiable credentials. So you can put that in your wallet, and whenever you want to show that you're a graduate of MIT, you can show that without paying the $5, right, for the transcript, as an example, right? So that's the whole concept over here.
But Sridhar, the patterns you were discussing sound like they would really work pretty much across any industry. Is there any other examples you'd like to share?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think those three, like I said, consumer experience is paramount to many, many, many industries, right? Many industries are basically saying that, sure, we've got millions of IDs, but can we enable, Eric, to your point earlier on, bring your own identity? Can we enable this as another protocol in the stack to allow people to bring in their own identity? For sure, you can't trust them with keys to the kingdom, but allows them to come in so that then you can do your progressive registration or adaptive access to ensure the right level of access, right? As well as, many industries are looking for safeguarding the risk and the ecosystem. Those are the three patterns that I was talking about. This is a quick picture to talk about the details at a 100,000-foot level, right? The numbers that you saw before, 1, 2, 3, 4, primarily show the flow of information, right? And number one being that distributed ledger technology, right? This is where the public key information is kept, as an example. 2 and 3 are things like, 2 being the protocols, and 3 being the information that you throw through protocol, and 4 being the governance, right? So what you're beginning to see is, Eric, to your point, it's a fairly standardized architecture that we're evolving into that can be applied to many industries. And example being we talked about healthcare before, we talked about airline. In the financial space, we're working with few to deal with KYC, right? Especially, in countries like Singapore, we're taking close to 14 or 15 different types of proofing mechanism to be able to conduct business there, right? Imagine that poor soul who is trying to go conduct business. You don't want to inhibit them. They want to give you money, right? So this is the technology in which how they're sharing information across the different financial institutions, across different entities, government entities, so that we can process that paperwork really quickly to show that this is indeed Eric, right? We're also using it for AML between different regions of Denmark and Norway and Sweden, the Scandinavian countries coming together to say, how do we stop some of the anti-money laundering situations where you're able to know exactly that how much money has gone in, so that you're not evading taxes, etc.
So I think this is a good point. If there's anyone in the audience who has use cases that you want to share or that you're looking at or the industry you're working with, please add them to your Q&A so that when we get to the Q&A at the end, we can actually walk through those specific use cases. Because I know we need to move on, but I just want you to have an opportunity. If you've got a use case you're interested in, please put that in your Q&A. So I think,
All right.
Eric, sorry. Eric, you had a question.
Oh,
That's Chris. I just finished.
okay. So we've talked through concepts and possible use cases, and so this leads me to ask, what are the standards that would help companies and organizations adopt this distributed decentralized identity technology?
Yeah, as you saw, I was trying to give a little bit of peek into that, the technology, not necessarily something that we can do in a short time, but as you can see, right, the use cases are talking about mechanism where number of entities are working with each other, and as Chris, as you said, standards are paramount over here, right? Without standards, even your first question. We're talking about federation. The success of federation was based on the adoption of the standards, SAML and OpenID and OAuth and the profiles thereof. Same concept over here, right? You cannot go and do it on their own. I think if you look at these 4 layers, the first one is at the bottom, going from bottom to the top, is think about it as a steel pipe. It's like that distributed public ledger where information goes in, you cannot see it, you cannot cut through it, presumably. I know you can cut steel, but work with me over here, right? Right? And then what do you flow through that pipe? That's where that protocols come in, right? The protocols in the layer 2. And then what is the information that you're putting into that? Whether it is an ID or it's a transcript in MIT's case, or it's a healthcare immunization record, that becomes the content. And all of these have to be governed through some sort of a body, right? Like if you look at some of the things that has shaped the identity industry, OASIS and W3C, right, have helped us shape that in terms of having that mechanism where, an identity provider and a service provider can talk to each other through a number of related protocols. So what has been happening is a lot of work has been going on in all of these 4 areas, right? Things like Hyperledger, right? Variety of different parts, which are talking about how do you create that bottommost layer? Evolution of standards in W3C, like verifiable credentials, as well as things like DIF, which is the Decentralized Identity Federation, which is very similar to saying, where are you from, right? All of these are standards which are evolving. And then very recently, we've come together as an industry, both the technical as well as the business folks have come together to create an initiative called the Trust over IP, right? This is how we see the next generation of identity standards and specifications come to bear, and provides, what Kim Cameron once said, right? Internet is lacking that layer of identity. It is a reference architecture to drive that trust in the internet based on not just the geeky protocols that we deal with, but also the business and the social layers, right? So a lot of standardization work going on over here, and there's pockets coming up. Like one example of that decentralized ledger that we talked about earlier on is something which is evolving in the financial space and called Bedrock, where the financial industries have come together to create that quote unquote ledger. It's very similar to saying I've got a DNS server, right? Work with me and the analogy over here, right? There will be more such ledgers in the industry, but standards will help us bring it all together. So in a nutshell, I think absolutely standards play a very, very crucial role over here. I think, take a look at, trust over IP as that overarching umbrella of how all the standards are coming together under that technical and business governance.
Thank you, Sridhar. So what about customers who consider themselves, I know I have customers in this space, and I'm sure there are plenty on this listening to this discussion that are considered Microsoft shops. They have the full suite. That's all they carry. Everything's running Windows. Everything lives there. Is there any issues that these shops are going to have with using some of the vendors in this space that are kind of outside of that layer? Is there any interoperability challenges that they're going to have to deal with?
Well, I mean, for the purpose of today's discussion, I was pretty much wearing the hat of decentralized identity, right? What I'm speaking about is how Microsoft and IBM and a number of different vendors are working together, right? If you look at DIF, that is primarily driven by Microsoft in terms of how you are driving the mechanism to go and find that quote unquote ledger where that identity is stored, right? If you look at W3C, OSS, these are all something Microsoft, IBM, and a number of other vendors are working together to mature it. So, would I say that there's absolutely zero issue? No, I mean, I know enough that, that's why most of us are sitting on this panel as implementation gurus. But the standards enable that interoperability, right? Interoperability so that you can be a Microsoft shop, Eric, as you said, and be the issuer of that decentralized identity based on, W3C specification on something called DID, decentralized identity, right? It's a mechanism you issue that verifiable credential, Vinita, that you were talking about earlier on,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And once I have that, now, you hold that. Now, if IBM is a technology that is used by the relying party, IBM is going to use the same W3C specification on DID. On top of it, it's going to have the W3C specification on verifiable credentials to be able to understand, use things like DIF to then say, okay, I don't understand where this token is coming from. Let me go and check where it's coming from and look into the URN part of the DID to understand and call home, right? So I know I went a little bit geeked out on this for 30 seconds, Eric, but you appreciate that, right? So that's how multiple vendors will come together. The only way that multiple technologies will come together is to standards, and the only way the customers and clients are going to be happy is these vendors that adopt these technologies.
So Sridhar, moving on a little bit, yeah? You talked about passwordless authentication, somewhere where you were talking about those patterns, right? How does that fit in this whole journey to decentralized identities? How does it get me there?
Yeah, so I think this is a good question. We started the discussion somewhere around that with Federation as one such example too, right? Passwordless journey addresses that core aspect of how do we make the customer experience, pleasant and consumable, right? If you go to the next slide, the whole passwordless is a journey, right? Of course, it absolutely relies on having a solid foundational controls at the bottom of the picture that you see over here, which is ensuring that you have the right user access management and identity management and repositories. The hygiene is what I call. Once you get the hygiene done, you can start embarking on this passwordless journey. If you don't have the hygiene done right, the chances are you may allow somebody without a solid password validation that can put the customer at risk, right? So this is the example, Eric, I was giving you earlier on, right? When you talk about BYOD, I said, hey, sure, this is one example where you can use decentralized identity to bring in identities to the client or a customer, but then you have to have the foundational elements to say, how much trust do I give that user before signing up the keys to the kingdom, right? And how do I grow that trust over a period of time?
Yep.
So that's the bottom of this picture, right? It's fundamental. Make sure that you have that, hygiene well laid out. Once you have that, you can start on the passwordless journey today, right? Today you can start with, simple things like what you see with WhatsApp, right? QR code, easy. Anything which is out of band, right? You try to go to a website, I get a push notification from my mobile device, says, hey, Sridhar, are you trying to authenticate to this? Yes, I am, with a touch ID, and voila, you're in the website.
Yeah.
Those are easy ways to do it. The challenge with that is you're still storing information on the server, right? It's just that you're allowing that experience to be better than what it is today, right? Moving further along, Fido is doing a great job in terms of providing that consumability, as well as putting a little bit more control in the hands of the end user, where now you have the Fido devices which have your credentials. So without having to store the username and password at the central server, you can now store it on your device that can be used to go and provide that authentication as needed, right? And as you can see, decentralized identity is this journey beyond that, right? It's a next step in the journey where you can now put more control and consent in the hands of the end users, have their wallets, have the verifiable credentials that can be used across an ecosystem, and not only help with the consumability, but also with the security aspects.
Cool, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
So-
I think we spent a lot of time on this. Sorry, Chris, you had a question?
No, go ahead and finish up your thought, and then I'll ask my question afterwards.
Okay, so I said we spent a lot of time talking about use cases and the journey. I do want to pose a question for the panelists, right? I mean, you guys have tremendous experience in deploying large enterprise IAM programs. How do you see the journey for your clients to get on this roadmap or this journey, right?
So I've got a lot of clients who are actually looking at this, especially around the financial industry. The first thing I think that's really critical is you've got to learn about this. I mean, it's one thing to say, yeah, I want to go down this road. You've got to learn what it is. You've got to understand the concepts, which is like something like we did today, but much deeper. And I was actually reading a very good paper on this where somebody was saying, have a POC, put something together. And I know that standards and guidelines are still evolving, but put something together based on what is available, understand it hands-on, and then look to see what you can do with it. So start with something like, okay, I need to learn, I need to have a strategy, I need to have a plan, and then I can embark on this journey. That would be one thing I would definitely start my clients with.
Yeah, I think to extend what Vinita's saying regarding once you decide your strategy, part of that is what is your role in decentralized identity? Where are you going to fit? Are you going to be someone issuing these credentials? Or just consuming them? You have to decide what makes sense for your company and what role are you going to play. So it helps kind of decide what that strategy is going to be moving forward.
Yep. And I'd also say, if we compare the journey we took with the federated model, where we wanted to make sure we had our identity hygiene, we knew what repositories our internal versus external users were in. We had a way to kind of govern that whole life cycle and know that things were kind of being run and maintained. Similar thing with decentralized identity. We want to figure out on a maturity model, where are we within the our landscape? We really do we have some of those foundational components in place to begin the decentralized identity journey?
No, and I think this is critical because you've got to know where you are. You've got to know what you have. Because I'm on this new trip these days saying shop your own before you buy new stuff, right? And the problem is everyone's jumping off and they don't know what they have. So unless you know what your IAM is, and I know, Chris, you guys do a wonderful job with your IAM map, which actually lets you take it to the next step, which is look at what you have. We've got IAM Smart that tacks on with IAM Map and then says, okay, here's how it all fits together. Here's the quantified scoring of how you are. Once you know where you are, you can kind of figure out where you want to go. It's almost like you start a journey. If you don't know where you are and you're looking at your GPS and you're hoping that somehow magically you'll get to point B and you don't know what point A is, it's usually, well, it happens to directionally challenge people like me. I end up at point C. So just using that analogy, I think you need to know where you're going.
Yeah,
I think,
I'll actually, sorry, I wanted to add one more comment there. Just, talking about the IAM map process, we're going through that with one of our customers that wanted to focus on the external identity side. And, so we started going through the maturity questions about, are you really ready to start exposing and kind of managing that external population? And they realized they didn't even know, source information on half of their external population once we started walking through that.
Yeah, I think I was going to basically bring the technologist in me back again to say that, this is great, right? Vinita, to your point, know what you have, know what you want to do, and then get on some sort of a journey towards that. The technology is still evolving and maturing, right? Standards are maturing. And the way we are going to mature this so that we can solve this age-old problem of providing users better consent, better identity, and better privacy and all that is by collaborating a little bit more, right? In terms of how do you participate in some of these specifications? You don't have to necessarily write code, but even able to contribute a scenario would go a long way in maturing these standards. Working with your individual vendors, right? Most of you, as Vinita said, most of you have tools today. So how do you start asking your vendors to start supporting these newer standards? Just like, AES is going to go away and quantum safe cryptography is going to come in, and at which time you need to change your cipher suite. Similarly, SAML is good, but I think OpenID is getting more and more traction. So this will be a next generation protocols that the vendors have to enable so that we can mature the journey as well, right?
And like we talked about, you can become an innovation partner. We're a small company. We're not going to rush off and become issuers or providers. But we can all do things like, Sridhar and I have been talking about this for a while, become an innovation partner around decentralized identities and build something that can then take people to the next step.
Yeah.
So I think that's literally, this is kind of what we wanted to share with everybody. I hope you have those questions coming. And Katie, it's back to you.
Thank you, Vinita. This is Katie again, your webinar host. And I wanted to remind everyone listening that at the bottom of your screen, you should see question and answer and poll options. It is now time to complete and submit your poll. Remember, those that submit polls will have their name entered into a drawing after this webinar for one of 3 $100 Amazon gift cards. If you have any questions for our panelists, I know we have quite a few lined up already. Go ahead and submit those now, and here in just a minute, I will read them off. So I'm going to go ahead and end polling right now, and I'm hitting share results. So everyone should be able to see the results of the poll right now. Is it coming across to you, Vinita?
Yes, yes it is.
Okay, perfect. I don't want to take too much time on the poll because I want to leave time for question and answer, but I wanted to toss this over to the panelists and say, looking through these poll results, are there any patterns or trends that you want to call out before we move on?
First of all, I'm really happy so many people have answered the questions. Yeah. And second of all, I see that we got a good spread across the different industries.
Yeah, we definitely, it's like you got a mix of everything. You got a mix of industry, a mix of client versus internal versus external user populations. You got a little bit of everything.
No, and that's brilliant because, you know, a few years ago, if we had run this poll, everybody was saying internal users, and I was running around talking about consumers, and everybody wanted to talk about internal users. So I'm really happy to see we've got actually 56% that want both internal users and external. This is brilliant.
Okay. Well, thank you. So now we'll move on to the question and answer portion of this webinar. So keep them coming. So first question, what DLT blockchain systems do you use or recommend? Hyperledger, Corda, public or permission ledgers? Is there any application that can be used via APIs or so?
I think the whole beauty of at least today's discussion, the focus is on open standards, right? If there's one thing that we want to take away, I want to make sure that is open standards based, right? So the question is absolutely valid. Like, for example, if you have a public ledger like Sovereign that uses Hyperledger, right? And there are other blockchain implementations as well. So depending upon what is the ecosystem that you're working on, what is the the industry sector that you're working on, they may choose an appropriate ledger technology. I would personally say that a permission ledger for me is much more secure than a non-permission, right? It's basically providing a lot more control and governance in terms of who can put and who can take it out and provide that better quality steel pipe, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next question. It looks like this was directed towards you, Sridhar. Do you see passwordless authentication and decentralization as complementing each other?
So I think that's pretty much the question I was asking you, Sheila.
Yeah, and I think we talked about it, right? This passwordless journey, I guess I'm answering it in alliteration. Passwordless experience is a journey, right? The question is, what is the balance of the experience versus security versus the credential information? That all have to come to bear, right? At the highest level, you can give that passwordless experience, but if you're okay with putting the centralized credentials in one place, you can get started today, right? On the other hand, if you want to provide that passwordless experience where you don't have the risk of maintaining passwords, maintaining users, and being able to deal with in the risk of that, then you may want to gravitate more towards decentralized identity paradigm, basically, right? So that's more, and again, you don't have to have one size fits all. You can have some centralized IDs for your high profile users. You may have your consumers coming into decentralized, but create more attributes for them. So there is a variation of how you do. And that's where some of this, best practices and expertise comes to bear.
Okay. The next question up, do you see any activities for a federal model from the U.S. government? An example is given around an EBT.
I think there's a lot of initiatives going on in the federal model. There's been discussions at the policy level, at the standards level. I don't have a specific initiative to reference yet, other than saying that this is evolving. Just like I talked about financial industry coming up and announcing the bedrock as an example, right? You've got Sovereign, which is for more of a consumer-centric, open source kind of a thing. So the chances are that government will also have some of these things, right? So especially as you think about EBT and TSA and other things, education is another big one that we see that there's some movement going on over there to say, how do I make sure that as we are processing the loans of students and as you're doing the college loans and all that, that's a huge problem, right? That can be alleviated with some of the government, federal government initiated initiatives, but none of them are at a point that we can release or I can talk about it as a specific place that you can go look up. And not just U.S. government, right? I mean, if there are others in the audience listening, there's some which are more mature, like LISI, LISSI in Germany is a good one. FINDI is another one in Finland. And the Canadian government is expected to announce something fairly quickly.
Okay, next question. At the risk of oversimplification, this sounds like it conceptually mimics the certificate authority model. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah,
It
I
is.
was supposed to say that's the same thing I noticed too. That I mean, when I first started looking into decentralized identity, I think Gartner has a really good. They have like a little beginner's lesson around what is decentralized identity, and actually that's kind of the concept they put around it. You have an immutably transferred, public piece of this chain that's actually out there. That's what's shared in the framework, and then you have the trusted third parties are the ones who actually are signing the private key side of the actual transaction. So it inherently, if you're looking at it from a technological perspective, it is very similar to what you'd see in a certificate authority model.
I think the key difference is going to be because we learned from the certificate authority model, right?
Yes, exactly.
It's so complex that neither God nor man knows other than us what's going on. So I think we're talking about identities that span real people that don't come with, CISSPs and everything else. Mm-hmm. You've got to simplify that. And we cannot get overexcited about security. We have to make it usable.
No, absolutely right, Vinita. I think the point I was also trying to add on is to say that if you look at the physical world, right? I mean, I get my passport, I get my driver's license, and today this is Friday evening for me. It's almost time for a beer. I want to, I take my driver's license and go and present it somewhere, and I get a beer, right? Nobody's asking me what is your PKCS or 509 or nothing like that, right? It's that model in physical world doesn't translate to a model in the internet today. Yeah. And we've been trying to do that for many, many, many years. So certificates, centralized identity, federation, they are all evolutions of that. And as Vinita said, we're learning a bit by bit, right? Mm-hmm. And in putting that into something that, I'm not going to say this is the end all or means all. We will learn more through this and we will evolve. But this is a step in the right direction.
I mean, I think we've evolved somewhat just even from the standards around federation. I mean, there were standards written, but not necessarily followed. Everyone kind of followed them in their own way sometimes. So even from an implementation standpoint, things implemented differently, even though they were following a standard. So you still had little issues there that, those same types of standards keep evolving as well. So.
Yeah, and I almost think maybe a more applicable paradigm is decentralized currency, right? Because you don't tend to think of a central authority necessarily. It's more about the technology and framework being used by enough organizations that it can actually facilitate transactions.
Okay, for this next one, I'm going to combine a few questions into one, so give me just a second to get through all of it. What are the main challenges that decentralization tries to address from business and tech perspective? And how do I educate my C-suite? I understand security, user experience, portability, and risk are benefits. And is the industry ready for this change?
I think I'll ask the panelists to weigh in as well, right? Let me start with that. First and foremost, in terms of educating the CISOs, it starts with risk education, right? CISOs are worried about how much risk they're carrying at all points in time, right? This is a mechanism by which they can alleviate some of that risk. I don't think there is a one size fits all. The question is, if you're allowing these users to come into your organization that don't necessarily need the high level of security today, you can use something like decentralized identity to come in right? And reduce that risk. So having that risk conversation is important. We also need to cover the consumability, which is, I think, is real in the sense I've seen a number of clients struggle with consumability not being good. As a result, customers are leaving their websites or their portals or their organizations, and this helps in trying to keep that paradigm of what bring your own concept, right? I think once you educate, then it's a question of a journey, right? Of course, I would recommend a crawl, walk, run, which is to Vinita and other panelists who said that, right? Like, understand where you are, make sure you're ready for this, and then pick a scenario or two, right?
Yeah.
And it could be, in many cases, what I've seen is, Vinita, it's not just allowing external IDs to come into an organization. It is two groups not talking to each other, having two different identity systems, just talking to each other. That itself was a huge benefit to start with.
I mean, look at federation, right? We have so many things. We've got a standard, we've got it all there. But look at the financial sector. I mean, we're struggling with an application that says it's SAML compliant, but when you look at it, to Eric's point, it's SAML compliant, but, and then off we go down this custom route, right? So we've got to buy into something which we can all look at. And from a C-suite perspective, honestly, I think the most important thing I know is risk, but it's also complexity. You have to maintain a whole workforce that understands these complex models, whether it's, in the cloud or it's irrelevant. You are maintaining all this complexity to manage this. You're setting up all these portals. It's literally simplification and better user experience. Who would not, go for that, in my opinion?
Yeah,
I agree.
I think to touch on the industry being ready, I think just like Federation 2, it's not going to be one of those standards that is adopted at the same time across industry. There are going to be some industries that are going to be slower to adopt, and that's just the way it is. There's a lot of industries that, from a trust standpoint, that have to see it in place before they actually are ready to kind of take that leap of faith, so to speak. So it's going to be different depending on the industry in, and that's something we're going to have to watch as this starts to become more prevalent, is who are the early adopters? Who can we work with the most that is ready and willing to go forward to actually take this further along?
Yeah, and I would also look at, cases where, say some of the government use cases where they're validating your, name and, date of birth, state, driver's license number, those type of things. I mean, it's a case where you're authenticating, but people don't really, it's not a, typical ID password type authentication. To me, those might be some scenarios where it's, it's kind of seamless to do that vetting via decentralized identity.
Okay, next question. How does an identity's privacy, protected, or selective disclosure work when using this distributed public ledger? Are you guys able to hear me?
No, yeah, can you repeat that question one more time?
Yeah, it's
yes.
very complex. I'm also looking at it.
P3, yeah, so your privacy disclosures that you usually do with authentication for the most part, how is that get handled? I think is really what the question's coming across.
Yeah.
So sorry, Vinita, can you repeat that question one more time for me?
So how does an identity's privacy, protection, or selective disclosure work when using the distributed public ledger? So it's really
okay. So the way it's a protocols, right? So what happens is it's, when you first say, I want a service from a service provider, right? You send your verifiable credentials in a DID format. The W3C specification is going to pick it up and say, yep, here's an intention to do something on the service provider. The service provider say, I need to know, whether you are over 21, right? And there's a series of handshakes, which is it's called the zero knowledge proof. Some of you may have heard that terminology. ZKP is an industry term as well, right? So using those protocols, you're proving proof of possession. So using cryptographic algorithms, you're basically saying that, yes, I am 21, because I have a piece of information that I'm going to tell you how it is encrypted, and then you basically validate that on the other side without necessarily disclosing the specific data. Exactly, right? So that's what we use. And once that handshake is done, then the protocol is out. The distributed ledger is not where the information is kept. The sensitive information is always kept with the holder. The distributed ledger is where, think of it as a public key place where you know how to go and validate or decrypt information.
Okay, and I know we're right at time. There's one more question that I want to toss out, if we can get through this, and then we'll wrap up. Last one, I'm familiar with Sovereign. As I look at using that approach, several questions come up. I believe they apply to any distributed IAM systems. It's not reasonable to expect an enterprise to immediately adopt DID completely. How do you see integrating existing approaches with distributed IAM?
Rita, you want?
Yeah, I'm fine. You can go ahead, but I have an opinion. You can
No, please go ahead.
So I think this is the key to the whole thing. How are you going to take what you have and get to where you want to be? And it's got to be baby steps. It's what Sridhar said. You've got to crawl and then walk and then run. And so I would say take a couple of examples of whatever industry you're in and try and look at them. Maybe it's just your consumer portal with some small application that allows you to bring in this decentralized identities. Get that concept figured out, get it working, and then build on that. It's like OIDC or anything. Yeah. Start small, start somewhere, and then grow from there. I think that's the ultimate, test of how well your organization can approach this, as well as how well applications are ready to change to support this.
Yeah, I think that's right, Vinita. I mean, there's no right or wrong answer over here. It's the way you always adapt a new technology is to piggyback on the existing one, add incremental steps, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to go rip and replace everything overnight, right? Instead, I would say, okay, now that I have my identity management system mature, can I enable this for one set of use cases, right? See how that works, and then slowly dial the knob higher on one side and dial the other knob lower on the other side.
I would think moving forward, you would, especially in that scenario, vendors that actually allow you to integrate DID into their existing access management systems is what you're looking for. If it's a rip and replace one or the other, then that's probably not necessarily where you're going to want to start. You need someone, if you have an existing IAM, you got to work with that vendor and ensure that they're going to allow this as a gradual process. I'm sure the major vendors have all been looking at it. I mean, that's kind of why, Sridhar's here talking about it. We know IBM's, looking at it, and I'm sure the major players.
Microsoft is moving big time into this. Everyone's looking at it and trying to get their foot in there. So they'll become issuers, and then we can use their.
I would look at it in a manner, right? It's more than the foot, right? It's the supporting that client scenarios. To say, if you look at all the client scenarios, the chances are that the ecosystem may have different vendors from all technology, and that needs to come together. We don't want to leave the clients, hanging where you don't have the interoperability. That's the main motivation for all the vendors to support these standards as well.
Yeah, and I'll round this out by saying, don't be afraid if you can find a viable use case, even if it means that, maybe that, it's not necessarily tied into your existing, enterprise authentication model. It's not necessarily a bad thing to, have that experience be unique as the first part of your journey.
Yeah, cool.
We are now out of time. We'll make sure to answer the questions offline that we didn't have time to cover today. The next session in our webinar series is scheduled for July 30th at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. The topic will be improving identity governance with artificial intelligence and machine learning. I'd like to say thank you to all of our panelists. And it was pleasure having everyone who attended join us for this panel discussion on decentralized identity, and we look forward to having you join us again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Sridhar.